So, ancient law. We already know a good portion of material about law when it comes to an introduction to ancient law. And that is that our first laws, right, in Sumeria and Egypt, what were they? Centered around. And so, your early Sumerian laws were more concerned with farmers than city folk. They were more concerned about canals than whether or not your wife cheated on you. But it comes a little bit later with urban development, but also we see a great leap with law and an increase in actual written laws that everyone must follow with the rise of empire. So when we have an empire, we're usually ruling over diverse cultures, or at least diverse dialects. And maybe they have the same religions. A lot of times you'll have differing religions. This is the time of polytheism, of course. So you're going to have a lot of different cultures in one empire. In Bauer, you can read about Hammurabi. That was in our reading for this week. And how Hammurabi was all about control. He wanted total control of his military, total control of the goods, total control of taxation on what goods traveled through his roads that he controlled. So he started increasing the amount of tax collectors and officials, bureaucracy in general, to create that control. And a part of creating imperial control is establishing an organized legal structure. And these early legalized structures change depending on a class. So you might have your earliest laws had to do with, as we all know, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. There was a certain amount of, I guess you can say, equality, sort of almost an egalitarianism with law. Somebody poked out your eye, you would poke out their eye. Well, it's not as simple as that, because with these real early laws, and even throughout the ancient period, you had differing punishments for what class you were in. So if you kill a slave, not much of a penalty there. Whether in Mesopotamia or Greece or Rome, you would simply pay the owner of that slave, enough money to pay for that slave. But if you killed somebody who was a free citizen or a noble, the fines were much stiffer. You would come closer to being executed, of course, if you killed a nobleman. So even though these early laws are very crude and simplistic, they do account for class. So it's not just eye for an eye, but that has a lot to do with it. So if you're a slave, you had less punishment if you were to kill a slave. And so we go really, when we look at this, we go from localized city-state laws that has to do with maintaining the status quo and the redistributive economy, so agricultural laws. And then with imperial control, we get more specific laws, that has to do with an unfaithful wife, or a liar, or a thief, murder, what to do if a slave does this, a slave does that. Things that pop up in a more imperial and urban society that local judges must now sort of follow a regularized punishment scheme. So in other words, you're seeing enough humans and enough cases in any one week that it's better to have codified laws that are written down. Hammurabi's law code was in fact written down. And so we'll use that as kind of a foundation. We'll compare Greek democracy and isonomia to those earlier manifestations of law. And so we already know a big chunk about what I want you guys to know about Greek democracy. We already know how the Greeks made their courts democratic, right? How did the Greeks make their courts democratic? It's the same answer almost as how did they become democratic anyway. So they chose the jury by lot, and the jury chose by majority. That's democratic. When the majority wins and the jury members are chosen by lot. They're not elected, they're not noblemen, they're just a group of about 1,500 men that assemble, and they're chosen that day by lot. So there's a certain amount of randomness to it to prevent bribes and that sort of thing. So you want to know that how the Greeks created democracy in their courts. Isonomia, isos means equality, nomia, nomos, refers to the law. So equality under the law. So you want to understand democracy in the courts. If you don't quite understand it, you'll want to visit the PowerPoints on democracy in Athens from last week, government in Athens. And so today we'll talk about a separation of courts. But definitely be able to explain, that'll be on your exam, half of your answer is how the Greeks created democracy in their courts. So make sure you know that. Okay. Okay, so we're just going to emphasize the idea of Athenian democratic courts and law, Greek law, and the idea of homicide. It's more complex if we start getting into other laws, but if we isolate it to homicide, we can answer our main question. So one of the things you want to think about with ancient law, and this is across the board with early laws and laws in the Old West, even in the U.S. Old West, is the idea of blood feuds. A lot of your early laws, aside from agricultural laws, were basically creating regular, organized punishments for certain transgressions. And so a big problem in any culture, any society that doesn't have a firm, sturdy legal structure is the idea of blood feuds. Blood feuds, the most famous blood feud in the United States is Hatfield-McCoy. At least I think it is. Probably ask most people, they'll say that. And I got a couple other examples here. There are blood feuds still exist today, of course. They're starting up all the time, you know. And some of them are sort of tradition. So you can go onto YouTube and you can look up Irish family blood feuds, fist fight. Irish family feuds fighting. And you'll see these groups, and a lot of times they're narrated. There have been documentaries made on this, but there are these old Irish families who have been showing up to beat each other up for several generations. And of course it started somewhere. Someone did something against another, you know, a different family, and they never forgot, and the cycle of violence just continued. And I call that a more abstracted modern variation because they kind of revel in it. They know they're not going to be stabbed or shot in the night. They just play it out in an abstract way by fist fighting. They pretend to be like their ancestors, tough and violent, but it's really kind of just play. Even though it's real violence, nobody's dying or anything. It's just play, really. So a lot of these early laws had a mind to end these blood feuds, because if you control any one area and you have these, say, your most wealthy families, a lot of times a wealthy family will have an enemy family. That's just kind of the way it is. It's not exclusive to any one culture. So let's look at some modern examples, and bear with me, I don't know if this will pop right up. I kind of doubt it will. So let's view this real quick so you can get an idea about blood feuds, and the videos are kind of fun. So yeah, a lot of your early laws, they're curbing violence because of ongoing cyclic violence, not just the random violence that pops up every once in a while, you know, someone gets mad and murders someone else. There's actually a higher arc of murder, homicide that happens before a strong legal structure exists. And we don't know about it a lot of times, except through story and even myth at times. We don't understand sort of like how human nature really plays out when it's left unchecked, you know. So keep in mind that the idea of the blood feud is sort of like an ultra-violent. It's an ongoing violence that's hard to understand now, but has a big impact in various areas these emperors might be ruling in.
These children were born into captivity. They're not allowed to leave the house except to change a dress. They do this at night, every few months. They've never been to school, but they know that strangers are trying to kill them and their parents.
My children's hearts are like hearts of rabbits. They are always afraid. When I sleep, the children can't sleep. They are watching over me. They never ask for anything, not clothes or presents, not even cell phone. All they ask is to be free to walk outside.
Gion Mihili is involved in a blood feud. 22 years ago, his brother killed another man in a land dispute and escaped to America. Under traditional Albanian law, or kanun, Mihili is now the male responsible for the blood that was spilled.
The kanun was codified in the 15th century and for hundreds of years held precedence over both state and religious law in northern Albania. The spilling of blood, it says, can only be avenged by blood. No reconciliation is necessary, no financial settlement acceptable.
Mihili has sent dozens of ambassadors to his pursuers. The response has been at least 5 attempts on his life. Even the authorities cannot help him.
I am afraid of the Albanian state much more than my pursuers. I have written several letters to the government. They sent the police and a social worker to my house who said, "Why do you keep complaining and writing letters? Stop asking for help. You are in a blood feud. This is where you are going to die."
2 years ago, the Mihili family nearly escaped the town of Shkodër by driving to Sweden. They were turned away after Albanian authorities claimed they could protect the family. It's a problem faced by some 600 families in blood feuds here who've set up a reconciliation committee led by Gjin Marku.
Albania is under pressure from the European Union to build a proper state and is afraid to confess that it cannot protect its own, so it's forced to lie. But this is irresponsible. It is not only a lie, it is a crime at the expense of the families that are hunted down.
The Kanun explicitly states that women and children should never be targeted. It was a code designed to uphold male honor while protecting the weak. But honor has been lost, and the weak are prey to the strong. John Saropoulos, Al Jazeera, Shkodër, Albania.
So what's interesting about that, I think, is that it starts off talking about this one family. And then they talk about how there's about 600 families that are victimized about this. And it's institutionalized. Even the government workers said, this is the way it is, Go back home. That's how you're gonna die, So it's a reality that still exists. And at one time, it was a big problem, as you can imagine. So ending blood feuds, real early need for homicide law, even way early on in Sumeria. And it wasn't just a matter of every once in a while somebody murders somebody else and they have trouble dealing with all the murderers. No, not at all. You could deal with a murderer with a normal local court system. It's when these big sort of systemic issues pop up that with these homicide laws, that these early homicide laws are concerned with. So let's talk about murder in Greece and Athens in particular. Miasma is a Greek word which is translated as pollution. The Greeks, as part of their religious beliefs, believed that if you murdered someone, you would be carrying pollution with you. Murder sort of creates a sin in a way that floats above your body. It was often visualized as like a black cloud floating above your body, which we see that on animation. We see a character who's a cartoon character who has a black cloud form over him or her, and it starts raining. And I often think of miasma in that way. And so Greeks believed that if somebody murdered, even if you were a soldier, you had a black cloud above you. And it would have to be cleansed. And these cultures, Greeks and Romans alike, when you would go out to war, you would not bring your war weaponry and march it through the city in Greece. The Romans would do this. It's because of pollution. You wouldn't bring a weapon, carry it around, and you especially wouldn't think of murdering somebody in the city. The idea of carrying around a sword and possibly threatening somebody with it in a city was way looked down upon. We think maybe, they were a little bit more barbaric people. Maybe they were like that. Well, no, if you were in the city proper, the idea of murder was unheard of. It was a spiritual crisis. It's, of course, scary to think of a murderer loose, but it's the murderer had a certain spiritual stigma on them themselves, and you had to cleanse the city of them. They had a miasma. And so the Romans, the way they would cleanse their soldiers is they would have them walk through the temple of Janus. We call it Janus, or Janus these days, but the Romans didn't have a J sound. And the god of Janus is a two-headed god, looks both directions. And what the Roman soldiers would do when they would go back to Rome is they'd walk through this temple and they would be cleansed from the pollution during the war. And so in Athenian and Greek law, if you murder, you want to identify the murderer, especially if they had bad intentions, and you just remove them from the city. Many murderers, of course, would, if they were found guilty, they would be sentenced to execution. But you had a day to leave. Self-imposed exile. Self-imposed exile out of a city, so you no longer have a family, you no longer have a main city, is a way you wouldn't want to go in ancient times. You don't want to be without a city. You don't want to be a wanderer. You're eventually going to become a slave or a servant to someone else, or just die out in the wild. You're going to be exploited, if not murdered. So to no longer be a citizen or a part of the city is in many ways as bad as executing someone. But you do have a chance to leave the city and everything you know before you're executed if you're sentenced. Okay, so here's a question. What courts did Athenians have for homicide? Remember, we had the ancient law of eye for an eye regarding peers, but lesser penalties for harming slaves. This is also true in Athens, lesser penalties for harming slaves. And so we're mainly talking about citizen versus citizen in the homicide courts. There are exceptions. Here are the different, we have 5 different courts that handle homicide. And so the main contrast here is that we have early primitive laws for homicide. And everybody knows what homicide means. It means murder, killing. And you would have laws, so if you were a noble who killed another nobleman, you just had written laws that then you would seek judgment, and that written law would pretty much determine your punishment. A very simple one-way algorithm. But the Athenians, like all their other democratic structures, they make the homicide courts more complex and more fitting, so not so one size fits all. So what you see is an increasing complexity in legal structure and government structure from the old empires to Greece, and then Rome does the same. They become even more complex. We talked about how last week, Rome separated assembly powers, and they made it more complex. So in other words, aristocratic powers and senatorial powers and the commoners would all have a say, but they're all in separate assemblies. Well, think of it this way: the Athenians just separated their homicide courts, made it more complex, but as society develops, it becomes more complex. So think of it that way. It's more fitting, but it's also more complex for an urban environment. The Areopagus was a court. That was your main, when people think of homicide, this is what they think of: intentional homicide. So if you're accused of intentionally killing another citizen, you would go to the Areopagus. The Areopagus was filled with your elders. Your Areopagus were actually aristocratic folk. And so they took, this sort of main idea of homicide very seriously. It was your highest court, essentially, that you would go to, the Areopagus, for intentional homicide. And when people think of homicide, this is what they think of. You had the Palladion, unintentional homicide. So if you accidentally murder somebody who you hired, they fell off your house and their neck broke, but it was, you told them to go up there and make a repair or something, Unintentional homicide. You were playing with your spear and you accidentally stabbed your friend who you didn't realize was behind you when you were doing this new move, unintentional homicide. But notice in the Palladion, you also have killing of slaves. So that means it's intentional or unintentional. See how the slaves are, a lesser class? If you kill a slave, no matter what, you just take them to the Palladion. You'll probably just get a fine. The Delphinion, how interesting, they have a different category for rightful murder. So self-defense maybe, or if a criminal act was taking place and you murdered that person rightfully. Delphinion would try cases of murder for infidelities. In Greek law, if you caught your wife in the act of having intercourse with another man, then you could kill that man. But if you only heard that it happened, you couldn't go kill that man. You had to catch him in the act. So, and you were not obligated to murder the male who's in your house copulating with your wife, but you had the right to murder him. And so we actually have text of a court case. They're called forensic speeches. And it was a speech of a man who did just that, killed the lover of his wife. The case was really fishy because the opposition argued that he didn't catch them in the act. He actually trapped the guy in his house and brought his friends over so they could serve as like false witnesses, and then they all murdered him together. And so they were his alibi. So who knows what really happened. The Prytanion, inanimate objects and animals. So whenever someone is murdered, whether it's intentional or not, then you have that miasma pollution, right? So this is why you have to have a separate court for inanimate objects and animals. You actually have to take that seriously. So if there's a pet dog who kills somebody in town, well, that dog, maybe they don't think that dog had malicious intent or what have you. But you have to get rid of the dog. You have to move the dog out of the city to remove the miasma. Same is true for inanimate objects. It's kind of humorous, actually. So if you're out working under the Acropolis, the really tall plateau in the city administration center of Athens, and a rock falls on your head, well, that rock needs to be tried in court. And once that rock is found guilty, they have to take it up on the wall and throw it outside the city, because it has pollution attached to it. So we get a really interesting, very vivid almost, interplay between superstitious belief and how that superstitious belief directly affected something material like homicide courts. And then infriato, historians say there's no evidence that infriato was ever used. I'd like to think that it probably was if it was institutionalized. But this is in the case of an exiled citizen. Exiled citizens are not allowed to come back into Athens, whether they committed murder or treason. If they came back in Athens, Athenians would be obligated to kill that exiled person. So if an exiled person wants to be tried in court for some reason, they would basically have to take a boat very near Attica. We're very near the main court, like the dockyards of Athens. They would go, and they would actually go to basically a floating raft or boat, and never actually touch the land. And there a jury would try the case. And so it's kind of interesting. In exiles, they took that very seriously. The citizen was maybe, less than a mile from the actual beach. Why not go to the actual, if you're going to go all the way there, you might as well go on land and have the trial. But no, the Athenians had a court that existed on the water for that purpose. At least theoretically, we don't know that that actually happened. Okay, so all you'll need to be able to do is explain how Athenian homicide courts were more complex than earlier fixed laws regarding homicide. It might sound complex, but it's really simple. So all you're going to do is explain democratic juries and explain the separation of homicide courts. So you don't have to explain each homicide court. If you just want to talk about two of them and give an example on whenever you take that exam for this particular question, then you can do that. You don't have to memorize all the homicide courts, just maybe one or two to provide examples. So when I ask, how did the Athenians build complexity into their court structure, you can explain democratic juries and why that's important, and then explain the separation of homicide courts and why that's important. And you can mix superstition and religion in there like I did today to explain that. And there are many ways to explain it, but I touched the sort of essentials that you'll need to put in there. It's more complex because it's more democratic, and they have to build complexity into it to make it democratic. You have to build complexity into homicide courts because there's more than one type of homicide, and there's more than one way to deal with homicide. Unlike eye for an eye, life for a life, tooth for a tooth. There's now much more complexity in the system.